This is lesson 5 or chapter 5, part 2 on access controls. We're going to talk about the processes and requirements for the processes and requirements for authentication. There are certain authentication types. Knowledge, something you know, like a password, passphrase, or personal identification number. Ownership, something you have, a smart card, a key, badge, or token. Characteristics, something unique to you, some attribute that is unique to you, such as your fingerprints, retina, or signature. Since the characteristics involved are often physical, this type of authentication is sometimes defined as something you are. Location, somewhere you are, your physical location when you attempt to access a resource. An action, something you do or how you do it, the way you type on a keyboard. Each type of authentication can be easily compromised on its own. The use of controls from only one category is known as single-factor authentication. Systems containing sensitive or critical information should use at least two of these authentication types. The use of techniques from two or more of these categories is called two-factor authentication and provides a higher level of security. Types of attacks against authentication by knowledge. First is a brute force attack. It involves trying every possible combination of characters. Modern password crackers don't try every combination of letters, numbers, and special characters in alphabetic order. Rather, they first measure what's known as the entropy, a measure of randomness of characters. Then they test low entropy words first, medium entropy words next, and high entropy words last. Dictionary attack works by hashing all the words in a dictionary and then comparing the hash value with the system password file to discover a match. Rainbow tables. This is not an attack but a tool. Because most systems store a hash of the password, attackers first pre-compute these dictionary words and build a table. Then they look up the stored hash version of the password in the table to discover the word that generated it. Okay, password account policies and best practices. You need to see the entire list on page 143 through 145. I'm not going to repeat them here. Of course, some of them are obvious. Use upper and lowercase characters. Use special characters if you can. 8 characters or more, maybe 10 characters or more. Use digits, numbers. Don't use dictionary words and a whole host of them. But in any case, the policies that you ought to be able to include in your organization are on 143 through 145. And the descriptions of password best practices are on page 144. Some of the best practices include create strong passwords, don't store a written copy of the password unless absolutely necessary. That's not necessarily true. If you could store a written version of it somewhere where it's safe, that would be very, um, that might help you. But you wouldn't want to put it like underneath your keyboard or underneath a mouse pad or something. If you can keep it secure, that's something that might help people. But really, it's not good to have it available in a way that other people can access it. Never share your passwords with anyone, even if it's your boss. Use different passwords for different important user accounts. Well, you should use different passwords for every account, but in any case, um, if you think a password is compromised, change it immediately and be careful when saving passwords on computers. You should not be using, it doesn't matter whether it's an important user account or not, you should not be using the same password for different accounts. So authentication by knowledge. The password, of course, weak passwords are easily cracked by brute force or dictionary attack. So you have to make sure that you ensure that you follow those password best practices. Now, a passphrase is a little bit different. It's stronger than a password. It's different than a password. It's longer and generally harder to guess, so it's considerably more secure. Because it usually contains more than one word, it might be an actual phrase, like several words in a row. It's more secure against dictionary attacks. You need to discuss also account lockout policies. You're locked out if you have too many, usually 3, consecutive incorrect attempts at logging in. Your user ID is disabled. The number of attempts is called the threshold, and like I said, oftentimes it's 3. Then you're locked out for a period of time, which could be anything from a few minutes to a few hours. They don't want you to try again 3 minutes later. So it could really be several hours before you can get back in without system admin assistance. You need to audit the logon events. One method of keeping track of who is accessing your computing environment is to audit the logon events. This provides you with a record when every user logs on or off a computer. And of course, this gives you evidence of who was on the system when something occurred. If it's something that was important that you need to know who might have had access to the system at that time. Authentication by ownership. So we have what we call synchronous tokens. These calculate a number of both the authentication server and the device. We have time-based synchronization systems. A time-based, the current time is used as the input value to the algorithm used. The token generates a new dynamic password, usually every minute, that is displayed in the window of the token. To gain access, the password is entered with the user's PIN at the workstation. No token keyword is required. The system requires that the clock and the token remains in sync with the clock and the authentication server. Event-based. This avoids time synchronization problem by increasing the value of a counter with each use. The counter is the input value. The user presses a button to generate a one-time password and then enters this password with his or her PIN at the workstation to gain access. One common problem occurs when a user creates a password using the token but doesn't use the password to log on, and the counter in the server and the counter in the token become out of sync. Continuous, used by systems that continuously validate the user's identity, done with proximity cards or other devices that continuously communicate with the access control system. An asynchronous token. These include things such as USB tokens, smart cards, memory cards with a magnetic stripe. They look like a credit card. The authentication server issues a challenge number that the user enters. The token computes a response to the value provided by the authentication server. The user then replies to the server with the value displayed on the token. Here we have the asynchronous token challenge response process. The user requests access by way of an authentication server, such as a user ID. The authentication server issues a challenge number to the user. The user enters the challenge number with a PIN in a smartphone. The smartphone calculates the cryptographic response, in other words, the password. The user sends the password, in double quotes really, because it's not a real password, it's one that's been calculated, to the authentication server, and the authentication server grants access to the application server based on that correct password that was created. So we're going to talk now about biometrics. Authentication by characteristics or biometrics. We have two types. Static, which are physiological measures, what you are, include recognizing fingerprints, iris granularity, retinal blood vessels, facial geometry, things that won't change. And dynamic, behavioral measures, what you do, such as your voice inflection. My voice inflection on this audio PowerPoint could be different, so that's dynamic. Keyboard strokes, that definitely could, the speed and frequency of how you key on the keyboard can be recorded. And signature motions, which is authentication by action. So those are dynamic behavioral measures of biometrics. There are concerns surrounding biometrics. Accuracy. Biometric devices aren't perfect. Each has 2 error rates associated with it. One is called the false rejection rate, or FRR. That's the rate at which valid subjects are rejected. So if you're a valid person, but it rejected you. False acceptance rate, or FAR, is the rate at which invalid subjects are accepted, which is more significant, it's more of a problem than the false rejection rate, because now you're allowing invalid people into the organization system. There's a trade-off between the FRR and the FAR. The point at which the two rates are equal is called the crossover error rate, or CER. The CER is a measure of systems accuracy expressed as a percentage. In practice, biometric devices that secure very sensitive resources are generally configured to accept a high level of false rejections. Acceptability. Certain biometric measurements, such as retinal scans, are more objectionable to some users than other measurements, such as signature dynamics. If a user is not comfortable with a system, they may refuse to submit to it. And reaction time. Each biometric device requires time for the system to check an identity and give a response. A system that takes too long may not work. If facial recognition at an airport takes too long, for example, greater than 5 minutes, the passenger checkpoint lines could become far much longer than they already are. Now, here we have all sorts of different types of biometrics: fingerprint, palm print, hand geometry, facial recognition, retina scan, iris scan, signature dynamics. Biometric technologies have privacy issues. They don't just involve collecting data about a person, they collect information intrinsic to people. Every person must submit to an exam, and that exam must be digitally recorded and stored. Unauthorized access to this data could lead to misuse. The complete list and descriptions of all of these on this slide are located on pages 149 through 150. So there are some advantages and disadvantages of using biometrics. The advantages are a person must be physically present to authenticate. You just can't do it from a distance away. There's nothing to remember. It's just your particular biometric that the system is using. They are hard to fake. Lost IDs or forgotten passwords are not problems, but there are disadvantages. Physical characteristics may change. Your voice may change. Your eye color probably wouldn't change, but your fingers and your fingerprint really can't change, but your hand could get sweaty when you actually put your hand on a hand reader or a fingerprint reader. Physically disabled users might have difficulty with systems based on fingerprints, hand geometry, or signatures. Not all techniques are equally effective, and it's often difficult to decide which technique is best for a given use. The response time might be slow. Required devices may be expensive. Depending on an organization's size, the organization may have to provide a large number of such devices. So authentication by location and action. Location, of course, is a strong indicator of authenticity. Are you where you're supposed to be? Additional information to suggest granting or denying access to a resource. So it does provide other information that some methods don't. Action stores the patterns or nuances of how you do something. So it records typing patterns, for example, how you do something. Now we're going to discuss single sign-on or SSO, and we have a whole section on this. Sign on to a computer network once. Identification and authorization credentials allow the user to access all computers and systems where authorized. It reduces the human error, fewer sign-ons to remember. It's difficult to put into place, but even though our text states this, here at Georgia Southern we use it, and at Armstrong even before that we have had this in place for quite some time, if you consider that we used SSO at Armstrong before we ever used it when we were consolidated as Georgia Southern. Now, the advantages of single sign-on. It's an efficient logon process. The user only has to log on once. It can provide for stronger passwords. With only one password to remember, users are generally willing to create stronger ones. It provides for continuous clear reauthentication. Single sign-on server remains in contact with the workstation and monitors activity. It allows timeout thresholds that can be enforced consistently throughout the system near the user entry point. When workstation or endpoint device is not active for a certain period, it can be disconnected. In fact, if you're on the Georgia Southern system and you sign on with a single sign-on, I know that if I'm away from Folio for a while, it'll sign me out. It protects the system from a user leaving a workstation open that an unauthenticated person who could pretend to be the original user. So it could be open to an unauthenticated person, and it prevents that. Provides failed login attempt thresholds and logouts. Protects against intruder using brute force to obtain an authentic user ID and password combination. provides centralized administration, and ensures consistent application of policy and procedures. But there are disadvantages. Compromised password lets um, an intruder into all areas that should be "and" instead of "and" into all areas open to the password owner. Using two-factor authentication and dynamic passwords can reduce this problem. Static passwords provide very limited security. Adding single sign-on to unique computers or legacy systems in the network might be difficult. Scripts make things easier to administer, but they expose data. Scripting doesn't provide two-factor authentication, and the authentication server can become a single point of failure. Now, there are three server methods for single sign-on. The first is the central server, where the user contacts it for all requests. The next is called a federation. Federated authentication systems share user credentials among servers. That should only be there once. Users only see initial sign-on process. Credential sharing after sign-in happens behind the scenes among trusted servers. And there's something called transitive trust. The initial sign-on credentials are forwarded by request to other trusted servers. An authentication server will only share user credentials with another server that it trusts. Transitive trust is only slightly different from a federation. In a federation, it's a group of authentication servers and it's static. With transitive trust, a group of trusted servers builds over time and can be different for each user and request. The servers in the trusted group depend on the access request path the user follows. So some processes, Kerberos is widely used, a computer network authentication protocol that allows nodes communicating over a non-secure network to prove their identity to one another in a secure manner. It's designed is aimed primarily at the client-server model and provides mutual authentication. The user and the server each verify the other's identity, and we'll talk more about it on the next slide. The Secure European System for Applications in a Multi-Vendor Environment, or SESAME, research and development project funded by the European Commission, developed to address some weaknesses in Kerberos. Unlike Kerberos, it improves key management by using both symmetric and asymmetric keys to protect interchanged data. It's essentially an extension of Kerberos. It offers public key cryptography and role-based access control abilities. And then lightweight directory access protocol, or LDAP, is used for defining and using distributed directory services. One of core services LDAP provides handling access control credentials. LDAP makes it easy for administrators to manage logon and access credentials on computers and devices across a network. LDAP is open source and doesn't rely on any specific vendor's product. Since LDAP routinely exchanges sensitive information across networks, it is essential to secure the messages. Our final slide here in this part 2 talks about Kerberos, and I'm not going to read all this about the key distribution center. What it serves first, it does serve as the authentication server, and it serves as the ticket granting server. Now, I will say the authentication server of the KDC verifies the user and requested service are in the KDC database and sends a ticket. The ticket is the unique key for the user that is time-stamped for the requested service. If the time expires before the ticket is used, the ticket won't work. Included in the ticket are the user ID and the session key, as well as the ticket for the object encrypted with the object's key shared with the key distribution center. With Kerberos, security depends on careful execution and maintenance. Lifetimes for authentication credentials should be as short as possible, using timestamps to reduce threat of replayed credentials. KDC must be physically secure because it and the authentication server are a single point of failure. Now let me leave this up here for another few seconds so you can read it. Okay, so this is the end of part 2. In part 3, we'll actually talk about the different kinds of policies that are used in access control.